Turn my video off. Okay. Uh, Hi, my name is Chris Lopez, and this is a possible Jain response to U.S. torture during the War on Terror. Uh, so my ethical issue is the United States' use of torture during the War on Terror, especially the CIA's detention and interrogation program post 9/11. After 9/11, the US government expanded its counterterrorism efforts in the name of preventing future attacks. And one major part of this response was the CIA's use of what the government called enhanced interrogation techniques. This included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, confinement, and other coercive methods used against suspected terrorists. The Senate Intelligence Committee's report argued that these methods were not an effective way of gaining reliable intelligence and that the CIA misrepresented both the brutality and usefulness of the program to policymakers and the public. And so a key part of this issue is the difference between enhanced interrogation and torture. Jamal Barnes argues that during the War on Terror, the United States did not simply defend torture openly. Instead, it tried to narrow the definition of torture so that certain harsh interrogation practices could appear legally and morally acceptable. This makes language itself part of the ethical issue because words like enhanced interrogation can make physical and psychological harm sound more controlled or acceptable than it really is. And so John Kiriaku's case adds another important layer to this topic because as a former CIA officer, Kiriaku publicly confirmed the CIA's use of waterboarding and later became one of the only people imprisoned in connection with the torture program. Not for carrying it out, but for disclosing classified information. Now, his case raises questions about government secrecy, whistleblowing, and accountability. And because of this, the issue is not only whether torture is effective, but whether a democratic government can violate human rights and punish the people who expose it. And so of my four tensions, tension one is that there is a conflict between national security and human rights. Supporters of harsh interrogation argue that post 9/11, the government had a responsibility to prevent future terrorist attacks. And critics argue that torture violates human dignity and remains wrong even when the state claims emergency circumstances. And tension two is that there is a conflict between legal language and moral reality. The term enhanced interrogation itself made torture sound controlled, professional, and legally acceptable. But Barnes argues that this was part of a broader effort to redefine torture during the War on Terror. Now, third, there is a conflict between government secrecy and public accountability. Kiriaku's case raises the question of whether whistleblowers should be punished for exposing wrongdoing, especially when many people involved in authorizing or carrying out torture avoided serious consequences. And lastly, there's also a conflict between individual responsibility and institutional responsibility. Torture was not only committed by individual interrogators, it was also supported by legal, political, and intelligence institutions. Now, a possible Jain response to the US torture program would probably begin with ahimsa, but it should not stop there. Bab explains that Jains are widely known for ahimsa as both a religious ethic and deeply rooted cultural value. Wiley also defines ahimsa as the central moral principle of Jainism and explains that it includes not harming others, not causing others to harm, and not approving of harmful actions. Now, on one level, this creates a very strong critique of torture. Torture is intentional harm against a captive person, so it seems to directly violate ahimsa. However, the harder question is how Jain response should deal with the state's claim that it is trying to prevent even greater harm. After 9/11, many Americans feared another terrorist attack, and so supporters of harsh interrogation could argue that the government was trying to protect innocent life. Now, this creates a tension inside the Jain response itself. Jain ethics would likely oppose torture, but it also has to confront the difficult question of what one should do when refusing violence, and that might seem to leave others vulnerable, right? And so this is where anekantavada, or many-sidedness, makes the Jain response more complex. Valeli explains that anekanta and ahimsa are connected because recognizing the limits of one's own perspective can itself be a form of nonviolence. Applied to the torture debate, this means a Jain response should not simply flatten the issue into America was evil or the CIA was protecting us. Anekantavada would require attention to multiple standpoints, the fear of citizens after 9/11, the suffering of detainees, the pressure of intelligence officers, the secrecy of the state, and the moral risk faced by whistleblowers like Kiriaku. Now, at the same time, Vallely suggests that many-sidedness does not mean giving up moral commitments. So Jain response can recognize the fear and urgency of the war on terror while still refusing to let fear become a complete justification of torture. Now, a second tension comes from the difference between personal ethics and political reality. Bab notes that Jainism has an ambivalent relationship with the state because the state depends on force, while Jain ethics deeply criticizes violence. This matters because torture was not just a private moral failure, it was part of a state system involving lawmakers, interrogators, policymakers, secrecy, and public fear. Now, Howard's discussion of war and karma helps here because she shows that Jain traditions can recognize the political pressure to use force while still treating violence as karmically and ethically dangerous. A possible Jain response might therefore avoid saying that political leaders face easy choices. Instead, it would say that even when violence is defended as necessary, it still carries moral consequences. And so torture might be presented as national defense, but a Jain view, it would still risk damaging the souls, judgment, and institutions of those who force it. Now, finally, Jain ideas about kasayas, or restraints and responsibility, complicate the issue of blame. Wiley defines kasayas as passions such as anger, pride, deceit, and greed, which negatively affect the soul. And a Jain response might ask whether the torture program was shaped not only by rational security concerns, but also by fear, revenge, pride, and the desire for control post 9/11. This does not mean every person involved was simply cruel or evil. It means that Jain ethics would be suspicious of the emotional and political condition that make the cruelty seem reasonable. The Jain Declaration on Nature and Gandhi's article both emphasize that one should not injure, oppress, torment, torture, or kill living beings. But the harder Jain point is that responsibility extends because the person physically committing harm. Since Jain vows include not causing or approving harm, the ethical problem also includes the officials who authorized torture, the lawyers who redefined it, and the public that tolerated it. And these institutions that punish disclosure more harshly than the original abuse. And in this sense, John Kiriaku's case becomes especially important because it shows the tension between loyalty to the state and loyalty to a higher moral demand not to hide harm. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you all have a wonderful summer.